Good afternoon, and welcome to the Sister Act podcast, which is a project of the American Muslim Institution. I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman, and I'm one of the co-hosts on this podcast, along with Dr. Sabrina Dent and Haranessa Faryad, and we are excited to be with you today. We're streaming on Facebook Live. If you're there and you have questions for later on during the podcast, we invite you to comment and ask your questions. And if you're with us on Zoom, you can pose those questions in the chat. And we look forward to this conversation and sharing this afternoon. The title of this afternoon's podcast is The Invisibility Factor. Do you see me? We're going to talk about moments of challenge and experiences we've each faced, of feeling unseen or dismissed, and how our faith has helped us with those moments. And this idea for today's podcast came out of as always, a moving and powerful post that Haranessa posted to Facebook, and got us to talking and thinking that, we know that this is an issue that many women face, and certainly many female faith leaders face and confront. And so we're going to talk about those experiences and share how our faith has helped us in lifting our voices. And so it seems only right, since Haranessa posed the question or the topic, that we're going to start by having her share some of her experiences.
Thank you, Rabbi Susan. I appreciate that. So this is a really touchy topic on so many levels. I think that when we're just looking at life, and we're really honing down into what makes us vulnerable and how we expect other people to react to that vulnerability, it sometimes doesn't really go the way we plan. I think when I look back at my life and I look at the experiences of me feeling invisible or not heard or dismissed, and when I put that post up, it was really something that I was feeling at that moment. Or sometimes I post things when someone else messages me, and I want to get other people's perspective on it and see like what they're feeling about that specific topic. And vulnerability for me has always been something that I'm always delving into, especially for myself. It's something that I really, really want us to be a part of and be really tied down to. I think when we do it in such a way that it's connecting all of us, it makes the experience of our connection even more meaningful, and it really gets you to understand the other person, really makes you feel who they are. So I want to talk about actually my time of the number of times where I felt invisible. I wanted to talk about when I felt invisible as a child. And that really resonated with me because I wanted acceptance. I wanted to be loved. I wanted other people to kind of see me for who I am. And I felt like I wasn't getting that at that specific time in my life. So as you all know, I came to the United States as a refugee, and we landed in Queens, New York City, and that's where I grew up. So I went to PS 120, which is in Flushing, and I had started kindergarten at another school, but first grade I moved to PS 120. And I remember, like, throughout my elementary school, Mother's Day was really difficult for me. Not because, not just because my mother wasn't there, or I felt the void, or I didn't have that connection, because that's always something that I would feel, and I still feel that today. And me actually talking about this right now is, kind of emotional. I'm trying to control myself because it's very difficult to talk about it. But at the same time, I feel that if I don't talk about it, people don't get to see the vulnerability that we as human beings, especially as women, go through. So, right around Mother's Day, and I'm sure you both have experienced this as well, we have to do like these Mother's Day projects, or like gifts that we end up making as a class, right? So that one year in third grade, and I had Mrs. Scharf as a teacher. Her name was actually Marilyn Scharf. She was one of my favorite elementary school teachers. Very loving, very affectionate, very empathetic. And I still even remember what she looked like. So when Mother's Day would come around, I used to get really nervous because although I had my sister to make the gift for, I didn't have a mother to give the gift to, right? And so, but I was so gung ho about it. Like I really wanted to make something nice and I really wanted to do something special and, like celebrate Mother's Day, even though I didn't have a mother. I felt really alone in that classroom because I was the only child in the classroom without a mother. And everybody would say, like, oh, we're taking my mother here, we're taking my mother there, and this is what we're going to do, that's what we're going to do. And for me, it was just like, oh, I'm going to make this really cool thing in class and give it to my sister, And I felt like my classmates did not understand that. I felt that my classmates did not see me for who I was, and that was really painful. I would sit there making those little things. That year in third grade, we had like a block of wood, and she gave us glue to write something on, and then we could pick any colored glitter or the multicolored glitter, and then put it on top, and then put some stickers and other decorations. We were in third grade. It wasn't like anything fancy, but and it ended up being where I actually ended up making 5, 6 of those, not because I had 5, 6 people to give it to, but there were actually kids in the class who didn't want to make it for their mother. And I felt like, although they asked me to make it for them and I had no problem doing it, I just felt like no one knew my pain of what it was like, even making one for myself. And then on top of that, making it for all the other kids who decided not to make it for their mother. And the only reason they asked me to do it because I was on their case. Like, why wouldn't you want to make it for your mother? Don't you know how grateful you should be that you have a mother? There are people who don't have a mother in this world. And I was going on, I was just this third grader with a big mouth. And, but they couldn't understand where I was coming from. So, they got to a point where they're like, well, if you care so much about it, why don't you make it? And so while I was making these wooden pieces, I felt so much pain, and inside I was like crying, but I was just trying to like keep myself from expressing that or feeling it. Sorry. And so having that experience and knowing that people really didn't connect with me because of that loss that I had was extremely painful. And so I made them, those wooden pieces, but I really felt that no one saw me. No one saw that I had this void in my life, that I did not, you know, have what they had at home. And they took it for granted. And that made me even more upset. I was like about to pick a fight with this one kid because I was like, well, you have a mother and she does this for you. And he would come and talk about all the things his mom would do for him. And like, how do you take that for granted? Right? But I was available to make these things for them to give to their mother so that they could feel special because I wanted them to feel special. But it wasn't enough for me to feel validated or for me to be seen or for my emotions to be heard. And that's when I really realized, I mean, it didn't hit me right then in third grade, but when I reflect on it as an adult, that, childhood trauma and having that void of even not having your mother in the picture from the get-go really affects you growing up. I mean, even till this day, like you see, I'm trying controlling myself. It's a very emotional topic, right? And I say that because a lot of people don't get the gist of how important it is to have your parents in your life, especially when they're alive, right? People take the parents for granted. They don't understand that there's so many kids out there that don't have parents, that don't have a mother or a father in the picture. And what does that look like? There is a lot of pain associated with it, whether they're passed on or they're not living with them or not seeing them, that pain is evident, right? So just looking at it from that perspective, I think being invisible in that setting really made me, um, uh, you know, acknowledge my pain and acknowledge my invisibility factor when it comes to even now having conversations with my friends. They would talk about things they would do with their mother, and I'm just sitting there like, I can't participate in this conversation, and it's extremely painful. So that's my take. If we want to ask questions about that.
Wow, Harinessa, that is That is a very powerful story to share about your experience in third grade. So, first of all, I want to say thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that story with us right now. I am curious to know, was there at least one child at one point in the class that began to ask questions or to wonder more about your story? Because I mean, kids are very curious for the most part. So sometimes they do ask questions. So was there a child that eventually, started to ask questions?
No, not in third grade. Not in third
No.
grade because it's I don't know. At that point, no one really, at that age, it's so hard for kids to connect to that, especially when no one else in the class had gone through that. If there was another kid who didn't have a mother, I think they would be able to connect with me, right? But no one else
Mm.
was in the classroom to be like, oh, I know what she's going through, or I should even go ask her if she's okay. I mean, the teacher did because she was extremely loving and caring. But the students, everyone's in their own world. Everybody's thinking about themselves. And then, I had to I had a back order of the 6 other ones I had to make. And it was just something that ended up happening the way it did. But you realize that your losses and the voids in your life, especially with a parent not being around, is extremely painful. And even as adults, when we grow up with our parents and if they're no longer with us, that pain is real and we feel it, and we should feel it because it's a really tight connection that we have with our parents, especially our mothers. That not experience that for me and having that void of not having a mother, I think has left a hole in me that I don't think anyone can fill, even though my sisters did a great job raising me and are extremely loving and affectionate, but it's not the same.
Right, right. And how do you navigate that now? Like when
It's
friends
hard.
started talking about it. Yeah.
It's hard. Like sometimes I hear even some of my other friends like say, oh, my mother gets on my nerves, or she's doing this, she's doing that. And I'm like, God, I wish my mother was alive to get on my nerves. Like that's what mothers do. Like I get on my kids' nerves too, but it's part of the job. You're supposed to do that. It's supposed to be a pain. But just growing up, coming here to a new country without my mother being here, and then my father being sick, and being the youngest of 10 kids, I had to become an adult much quicker than a lot of my other siblings because I learned English faster than a lot of them. I started kindergarten, so it was kind of like put on my lap. I didn't have time to be a kid. In certain
Mm.
instances, I took responsibilities on that normally an adult would do. But as a child in an immigrant family, you're forced to do things that normally other kids wouldn't do. So I got to see things from a very different perspective. And my mother's void was something my all of my siblings felt. We all felt it. It wasn't just me, but at least they had memories. I don't remember anything. I don't remember her voice. I don't remember how she looked. Vaguely, I don't remember what she smelled like. I don't remember anything. So that's even worse because there's no reference except pictures.
Did you, when you experienced this moment in third grade, did you, I know you said that your teacher was very compassionate and loving and aware, but did you go home and talk with your siblings? I mean, was this something that you were able to bring up and share with them how you were feeling, and how did that help um,
Yeah, it did
or
help.
hurt?
My sisters, especially my second eldest who raised me mostly, she and I talk a lot about these things throughout time. And then she would always tell me stories about my mother so that I can have references, right? Like, this is what mom would do if this happened. My mom, although she was a wife of a very wealthy man, was very simple and very down to earth and humble. Her thing was about, spending my dad's money on the homeless people. She would make food and take it to the homeless people would come and ring our doorbell and she would feed them. That was what she did. And so those stories really helped me relate to her and have a reference point. So it wasn't like, oh well, we're not going to tell you anything and you just don't need to know, you just have to live with it. They did the best they could and they did talk about it. So I do appreciate that I have references and I have stories that I can share with my children about my mother, even though I didn't get to experience them.
Wow. I mean, it's great that you had your siblings to provide those references, but I definitely hear in what you're saying as far as not having that from your own first person experience.
Yeah,
So,
it's definitely different. It's not the same, So, and I'm not just going to water it down and make it seem like, oh, it's no big deal. It is a big deal, and it's something that I go through and think about every day. It's you know, even now being 42 years old, I still think about my mother. It's not like, you know, I've grown that need, you know, I just never had it. So it's something that I've had as a void as a child and now as an adult. But, you know, I wanted to share that experience because being invisible or being not seen is not just something that you go through as an adult, or, you know, in the work that we're doing, we see it all the time. And, you know, we could talk about this, you know, on and on and on, but I wanted it to relate to how, you know, our childhood really affects us as well. So we're going to move on to Dr. Sabrina. I want to hear about your experience in this and share with us something that you experienced personally and how this has really, you know, made you be who you are and your views on things.
Oh, absolutely. So my experience is more so in from my 20s. I remember a particular situation. So this was right after I accepted my call to ministry. And just to give you a little bit of context for those that didn't watch last time, but just a little context is, you know, I grew up in a Pentecostal household, but I accepted my call to ministry via the Baptist church. So I self-identified as a Baptist at the time. So one of the things is I was invited by someone from my mom's church, which was a Pentecostal church, to come and preach for a women's retreat. And so, you know, I thought it was an honor to be able to do this because there is this sense of acceptance of, you know, being invited back to the place that was a part of your foundation. But I found that the interesting moment for me, because when we initially talked about this, we raised the question of, is there a time where you felt invisible or dismissed? And so mine leans towards being dismissed. So I found that in my experience, I preached the sermon. Afterwards, I sat down and I had this very private spiritual moment where I was crying and reflecting over some of the words that I shared, and even just the spirit of the place at the time. And so I began to cry, and someone that identifies a woman, that identifies as an elder in that situation, came over to hug me. And while she was hugging me, I was crying. She said the words, "You need to come back to God and get out of that Baptist church." And in that moment, there was a lot of confusion for me because one, I'm thinking, this is all Christianity. Like, I'm confused about what's happening right now. At the same time, I was confused because I didn't feel accepted, right? That to me was the antithesis of what I thought via the invitation that was extended to me. And it wasn't by the person that extended the invitation. And the reason why it stuck with me for a very long time, and I know this because I even wrote about it in my doctoral document. I told this story about the experience and how it made me feel. And so the fact that I felt dismissed in that moment, which was supposed to be a sacred moment for me, reminded me of and helped me to reflect on how people of different religions and traditions might feel sometimes when they're not accepted by someone that proclaims a certain religious identity or belief system. And that actually played a critical role in shaping me in who I am today as an advocate for interfaith relations, as well as for religious freedom, because I truly do believe that everyone has the right to believe and practice as they choose, and also that it should be without judgment, it should be without discrimination. And so in that moment, that's what I felt like. I felt discriminated against because identified at the time as a Baptist. And I think it's very interesting. This is very vulnerable of me to even share this story, right, on this platform, because I've never had a discussion with the person about it. It was one of those things that, it's like, move forward from this, continue to heal as you move forward in life. But it was when I saw the question that you posed on social media, I wondered where that was coming from, but then at the same time, it was this reminder of this experience that I had that I couldn't let go of, but at the same time that I've used to really empower myself and empower others in the work that I do. So I'm very mindful, even more of when I observe that there are voices that are missing from a conversation or from the table, I try to be intentional about inviting them into that space, because I know what it feels like to be dismissed, and to be dismissed by someone that, was critical in my own spiritual journey as a child was something that, I really had to wrestle with. And so, I mean, there's still a lot of, I certainly believe that there's still a lot of pain with that, because you never forget how a person made you feel. That even years later, I was at an event and I saw this person, and it wasn't too long after this event had happened that I saw the person, and I was very cordial and respectful, but I didn't forget how it made me feel. And I think that is very important. That we practice like compassion and empathy, and that we don't dismiss people because they have a different belief system or have different ideas, or decide to be a part of a different denomination. Or, I mean, I wonder what that person would think now if they saw me, knowing how eclectic my spiritual journey has been. So that for me, like, that was the story that really shaped and made me think even harder about what does it mean to also value the human dignity of everyone, right? Like, this was a sacred moment for me, and I felt like parts of that was taken away because of something that was whispered in my ear. So yeah, so that's my story. And there are many other stories that could be told, but that one played a critical role because too many times women are overlooked. When you think about leadership in around the world, I think I read somewhere that only 5% of the women are 5% of women are Fortune 500, CEOs. So you just think about how this plays out around the world, but women contribute so much to society, yet we're dismissed, we're overlooked, and sometimes it's even by other women. And I think it's important that we call that out. Right, that we state that, because in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration, that we want to develop sisterhood, but we also have to call out the things that we see and we experience. So yeah, so that's my story right there.
So I wanted to, there was just yesterday, I think it was just, or maybe it was a couple days ago, but I saw the post yesterday. Basically, that same question you just asked was in there's a Facebook group for Jewish women clergy. I believe that was the place that I saw it, on that issue of how as women we need to lift each other up, and instead of the types of moments you're talking about and sharing that you experienced, thinking about how we help other women and support other women in their roles, and recognize that, and not just support it, but encourage it, rather than those moments of tearing down. Those moments where we feel less than. And I'm curious, now looking back these many years later, the journey that you've had, but if you went back to that moment, you said at the time that you were confused, and not really sure how. I mean, I can imagine if I had been in that place, I probably would have, just been very surprised and shocked, and not even have known what to say and how to respond. But how would you respond now? The voice
Wow,
you have now.
right. First of all, I would affirm my beliefs that I have that, I would question, I would probably ask that person to give a little bit of clarity first. Like I'm a little confused by your statement, because if you ascribe to a belief that says that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, does it matter, what a particular tradition I'm practicing? And to also say to the person, I'm so sorry that you feel that way. But this is my journey and this is my path and this is what is right for me. And that's the thing, is like, it's important that, that's the beauty of like real religious freedom, right? Is that you allow for everyone to practice their beliefs or not as they choose without, discriminating against them. Or in some ways, although I know it's a part of some traditions to do this whole thing as far as proselytizing and conversion. I come from a tradition like that. But what does it mean to just listen and learn and to respect the person and their views and their practices, and then get a little bit of that for yourself to help with your own spiritual foundation. So I probably would share some of that with them today, and just hope that they, I actually hope that they, in their journey, because like I said, they're more seasoned in life than I am, that they would have learned some different lessons since that time too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, having these kind of conversations with people when they put you on the spot, it's like, wait a minute, how do you answer this without seeming offensive, but at the same time, like, wait a minute, I'm not going to let you get off the hook. Right. It's a very delicate rope to walk, and then on top of that, when you, like, if you were to address this right now as an adult female, right? How would you say it without seeming like you're being super sensitive as a woman, but at the same time, making sure your questions are being answered? And you mentioned before that, as women of faith and working in this interfaith and religious freedom work that, we're so ingrained in, all three of us, it's so difficult to, always be on the lookout when men relegate us. And it happens so often that sometimes men don't even realize it's happening, right? That they will relegate you and put you on a spot, even if you're at the same level or even above them in whatever it is you're talking about. That because
and even when we respond, we often get accused of being defensive,
right?
Yes.
Exactly.
recognizing their actions.
Right. So when do we allow or we give permission for men to treat us that way? Because we've all experienced it, and it happens so often that we need to point it out, right? We need to pull the person to the side and say, hey, what you just did was extremely offensive, and you would not have done that had I been a male. And you need to be really quite aware of what you're saying and what you're doing, because it does happen a lot. I mean, I used to think that it would happen more in the Muslim community, because all the time people are like, oh, we want an imam to speak. That completely leaves out women, right? Completely leaves out the women who are scholars, or women who speak on faith issues, or, talking about the American Muslim experience. And then, then you have female rabbis and female pastors who all that I've actually talked to say, oh no, we get dismissed also. Right. And I'm sure Rabbi Susan can attest to this in different areas of your life, right? It's not just work or people that you're in contact with in that sense. It's just, it's just sometimes by nature, people don't realize that they're saying things that perpetuate this cycle of putting women below the men. I'm just going to say it clearly because it's just easier to say things where people can understand that you are doing that when you constantly ask for a male speaker to come and speak on your panel full of men, you're leaving the women out constantly. And it's not like there's lack of women who can speak on the topic. There are a plethora of women who can speak on every topic there is. But, like the other day, I just saw a flyer of this Islamic conference that was going to happen online. There were six men, not one woman. And, some of these people are like pretty affluent people. And I'm like, why would you get on a panel discussion when there are no women on the panel? I'm like, it should be half-half.
Right. Well, I mean, that happens, Renisa, also I've seen it in the Black church. Like, I've seen it where there's a panel where they're predominantly men. So, I mean, the same thing, it happens in many different communities. So I can relate to the experiences that you're talking about as well. And I think it's important that we as women continue to call it out when we see it and say something. So I think that is so important.
Yeah, we have a name for it, which you may have heard too. At least in the Reformed Jewish community, we call that a manel, when it's only men on the panel. And I will say that I didn't come up with
Sounds so bad.
But I will say that one of the things that, at least within the Reform community, the Reformed Jewish community, and specifically the rabbinic community, has worked really hard on this, on allyship and on thinking about and having conversations. A few years ago, they established a task force to look at the experience of women in the rabbinate. There have been female rabbis for almost 50 years. And also those experiences that people were sharing and talking about that, many of our male colleagues had no idea of some of what was happening, and some of them didn't realize how they were contributing to it. And I will say, out of that conversation, and it's still going on, but there have been wonderful allies who've come out of that too, and recognizing, I mean, I know male colleagues who will not sit on a panel if there are no women represented, and they'll tell that too. And it's not perfect, it still happens, but I'm very fortunate to work with a senior rabbi who, when a family calls and they specify that they want a male rabbi, he that isn't acceptable. I mean, it's it's certainly a gender shouldn't be an issue, and we also should stand up for each other. I feel incredibly supportive.
I think we should start a whole movement on this no manel thing. Start a Facebook group page and tag all faith leaders who
and I will say, like great strides have been made. And then I was on a meeting a week ago, 2 weeks ago. It was a number of rabbis, and we went into breakout groups, and the breakout groups had their conversations. And then when they came back, everybody presented, and somebody pointed out, not to the whole group, but that, did you notice that all of those who took notes in each group were female? That it was all female rabbis who had, whether stepped up to do it, we could say, but at the same time, there's still some of that role play that happens that is still gendered, and and changing that culture.
Yeah, we're going to do a couple of episodes on that. This whole thing about women in leadership positions being sidelined, especially in the faith community. Right. Because we all experience it, and it's something that we have to teach other people to stop doing and be conscious of it when they are planning events, to make sure that there's an equal number of men and women. I'm not even okay with one, like, oh, at least they should have one woman. Why just one? That's like saying, look, we're giving you what you want. But no, in actuality, it should be equal. I would rather have more women than men, because the way women talk, there's a dynamic that comes out. There's a connection that people can connect with. Men are very, as a matter of fact, and I'm not trying to put men down, but the vulnerability factor that women bring in, and the personal relations they have with the topic, really bring in the audience. It really makes them connect to what is being said. And plus, we haven't had women speak on so many different things, so our voices have been, shut and muted for so long.
Right. And I agree with what you're saying. And I do want to shout out, before I go to Rabbi Susan, I do want to shout out, there are a lot of men in my circle that do stand up and speak out on behalf of women and sisters that are doing the work. Also, I do want to shout out one of my friends, Reverend Melva Sampson, who, she saw this as a problem in terms of space, and she created her own space by creating, she has this weekly service on Facebook Live called Pink Robe Chronicles. And so it's like, there are women that are doing exactly what you've done, Horanissa, is like make the space for ourselves to have these conversations. So,
but before you go to Rabbi Susan, I do want to, piggybacking off your shout out, I do want to give a shout out to Shahid Rahman, who is the executive director of AMI. Because when he heard about this podcast that I was starting, I mean, he was just like, oh, wow, all female, different faiths, you know, what can I do to help? And that really made me feel so good that a man who, you know, of his stature and his presence would want to take this on. And he's been such a great help, and he's been so supportive on so many different accounts, not just, you know, taking this on, but like helping technical stuff, calling us up, right, talking to us, getting our insight, and literally letting us run this podcast the way we want to, instead of it being scripted for us and say, you can say this, but you can't say that. Like, we have free range. So I do want to give a shout out to Shahid Rahman. He stepped out right now, but I'm sure, you know, we'll send him this.
Yes. Yay for Shahid. Yeah. So Rabbi Susan, I mean, tell us more about your experience and the story that you want to share where you felt invisible or dismissed.
So I, you know, as we had talked about before, I was really kind of challenged at first in thinking about this, because I was thinking about all these moments where I have I've been supported and had the opportunity to lift up my voice, and I'll tell some of those stories in later conversations, and then I remembered a moment which was, in some way, it was about being visible yet invisible at the same time. It was from very early. And I have to say, by the way, as you both know, Sabrina, you might not know this since we haven't stood together in public or in person. I'm a very short person, and for me, as a woman, that also is challenging. I mean, it's certainly challenging when I'm leading services on the Bima, and you know, we have a little step that I use. I'm not the only one who uses it anymore, which is great, but we used to joke that I would use it, but the bar and bat mitzvah kids wouldn't need to use it, and because just there's a height thing going on. So I've always been very aware of the fact that because of my size, there are times that I have felt physically overlooked, and also wondering sometimes if it was a physical presence that made me feel that way, or otherwise, you know, just the question of that. But then I remembered this moment from it was my second year of rabbinical school. And so my first year with a student pulpit, I was in a congregation where I was their rabbi. And even though I was a rabbinic student, but they didn't have a rabbi. So I would go there on weekends, and I was basically it. I was their rabbi. And it was very exciting. They, you know, for me, it was exciting. For them, they had a rabbi, a beloved rabbi for years, who sadly had died just prior to my going there. And when I came, they first said, you know, we always called our Rabbi Joe, because he was older, and he felt like that way the kids would be able to relate to him. He would seem more, you know, just a little bit more approachable, accessible. So, you know, we want to kind of keep that consistent. You're much younger. We want to call you Rabbi Sue. And I, you know, I had to get a little comfortable with that, but it worked, and it was fine. And then one of the early services that I was leading early on in the year, they told me a reporter was coming to the service and wanted to meet with me and talk with me after. It's so exciting. I was the first female rabbi in Northwest Indiana. I kept saying, well, I'm not a rabbi yet. I'm a rabbinic student, but first female rabbi in Northwest Indiana. And they sent someone from the Post Tribune to interview me. So she came, a young woman, probably about my age. I was in my late 20s at the time. And she came to services and sat through the service. I gave a sermon. And afterwards, we sat down for our conversation. And I was expecting her to ask maybe questions about what I had talked about, or questions about Judaism, or what it meant to be a rabbi and my journey, etc. And so she started with some questions about, about what I was wearing. And it won't turn off.
Hello.
Aye.
After the tone.
It's okay. It's called life and technology, and interesting things happening on Zoom.
Yeah,
Right,
I think it's recording me on the phone now. That phone won't turn off. It won't like just stop the ringer. So
that was cute.
the world. It's a world that we live in right now. So she started by asking me about my clothing and wanted to know what I would call the color of my suit. You know, is that a top? She started throwing out like color schemes, and I said it's brown. It was brown. I don't know what shade of brown it was. I just brown. And she, you know, she noted I was wearing pearl earrings. So she noted that I was wearing, you know, the size of my earrings and how high would I say my heels were? How many, was that a 1-inch heel? Was that a 2-inch heel? And I basically asked, well, what does that have to do with what this conversation is supposed to be about? And she said, well, you know, I wanted to think about your clothing because how do you think you dress? How would you dress for different situations, you know, as compared to your male colleagues? And I said, well, I would dress appropriately and professionally as I would hope they would as well. And it became this conversation that wasn't at all about substance, but about, you know, the artificial aspects and the trappings of, and I, you know, as when I look back at it now, I imagine, well, yeah, she didn't know what to do with a female rabbi, and that was a question: what makes me different from any of the men? But it wasn't about what my ideology was, or what my values were, or what I hoped to teach, or what I hoped to share with this congregation, or any of that. It was really about how I was dressed, and you know, I laugh about it now when I think back, but it's always been one of those moments where I did feel a little both invisible and dismissed simultaneously. You know, I felt like was I playing dress up? I mean, is that the way she or any of her readers would imagine it? How would you know, how would you know I was a rabbi if I was walking down the street as opposed to a male colleague? And that's always been a little bit challenging because that's not the first or the last well, it was one of the first times, but probably not the first. But I know that over time there have been moments where I'll meet someone who says, oh, I didn't know women could be rabbis. And, you know, sort of the surprise and the, you know, and then I feel that sense of pressure is not the right word, but I'm now this person's image of what a female rabbi is. Or just the recognition that there are that women can fulfill and fill lots of different roles and positions and have that ability, and rather than dismissing women or saying that somebody is being defensive or questioning whether someone's going to be able to take on the role of leadership because they are, you know, petite or may be soft-spoken in certain settings, does not necessarily tell you how somebody is going to lead or speak from, you know, from the pulpit or lead people in other settings. And I think that that when we get lost in that, and I think the same is true when we make assumptions about other women, or when we make those assumptions about men without recognizing or giving people the chance to open their mouths, I think we miss out. And certainly I think that that's still a challenge for women because there are those who automatically categorize or put women in certain boxes that men are less likely to be placed in. And the, you know, just the, again, how does what I wear affect or impact what I do? And I actually wrote a sermon about this. So that happened my second year of rabbinical school. My fifth year of rabbinical school, my senior sermon was on the Torah portion of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob dressing up in Esau's clothes. And but what I really talked about is the question of, I was a new mother at the time, and the challenge of being a new mother and having, wearing a suit, and do I not take the baby because I'm already dressed for work and I'm going to get spit up on my shoulder, and, and the questions of, do I need to always be in a suit? Can I go to the supermarket in sweatpants? And does that take away, if I see a congregant in the supermarket or in the gym or in other settings, does what we wear reflect who we are and what we're capable of doing?
Wow. That's
Wow.
intense. That's intense. Like hearing that, I mean, the gall of somebody asking you as a student who's going to be the first female rabbi in this area, the questions about your outfit and how that was the extent of who you are. Like, like
I've been trying to find that article.
Yes, please do, because I really actually want to know. Did you end up reading it? Did you read it when it came out?
At the time I did, and it must be somewhere.
Yeah.
I haven't found it online yet. If someone out there finds it, please send me the link, because I don't remember that it said when it did come out. And I know we talked about other things, because I remember when the article came out, and that's the only part of it that I could remember was the color of the suit, or the question at least about that, and how I looked or what I was wearing. That I forgot about whatever else she said, because I was just so stunned by that.
Right.
Do you think, sorry, Sabrina,
no, go ahead, please.
that type of rhetoric and questioning is something that you experienced even after that?
Yes, I definitely feel over the years I've gotten comments about clothing, and I've also gone, I came to the congregation I've been with for almost 20 years with a not quite 1-year-old. I've had 2 children since then over the years, so they've seen me pregnant, and and bodies go up and down over time, and whether it's how I look or clothes that I wear at a certain time, and I will say I definitely am aware of that, and how I present myself is important to me. But that's something I've always struggled with, and definitely I can remember a time after a service. We have our sort of social time. We call it Oneg Shabbat, which means the joy of Shabbat, and people come and gather together. And I was standing with a one of our former temple presidents, and we were standing together, and somebody came up to me and commented on my suit, and was that a new suit, and made some other comments about what I was wearing, and walked away. And then this leader turned to me. I mean, his jaw was like down to here, and he said, and I said, do you think they make those comments to our male colleagues? Well, they do, and I've had this conversation with my male colleagues too, because we've discussed this many times over the years, in terms of we used to wear robes for all of our services. We still wear robes for some of them, but the question of making sure that we don't get lost in that, our message doesn't get lost in the trappings of clothing, or how some people will just see us in the way that they do, without looking at the bigger picture. And so certainly over the years I've gotten comments, and yeah.
Wow.
And criticisms for my hair, is my hair long? Is it short? Is it straight? Is it curly? Is it in a ponytail? And I love that people, one of the things that I love about the work that I do in the congregation that I've been with for almost 20 years is that that I have this relationship with so many people in the congregation, and I love that they feel comfortable sharing those comments. And going back to what was said earlier, it's I have to feel good about my hair, or if it's how I'm choosing to wear it. Maybe there are reasons why, but I think it's also that sometimes it feels like I'm fair game for some of the commentary. And I honestly, there are some people who may not have the best intentions when they share it, or may not be thinking, but I think most of the time, I think it's a way that people feel that sense of connection and that accessibility. And I look at it from that perspective. And also over the years, it doesn't get to me like it certainly did that time. And, probably a few times when I was feeling more sensitive about it.
Right. Susan, thank you for sharing that. I mean, Rabbi Susan, it's so interesting because I can connect to that. I've had experiences about, my outfits, or when I did preach, like what I was wearing, just everything, the length of your skirt. Do you have a lap scarf so no one can see your lap from the pulpit and everything like that? So, but I'm curious to know, how did you take back your power, like from that moment? Because like we have the opportunities at times to take back our power. How did you take back your power after that interview, and to shape who you are now as Rabbi Susan, and with the incredible congregation that you have and that you've been leading for such a long time?
That's a great question. I will say that that I do feel like much of that power was there. It was just about accessing it or recognizing it myself, and not getting and building the confidence. I certainly was new in the job, so to speak, at that point. And actually, I think one of the very affirming moments I had in that congregation, I had a couple who were certainly who were older than my parents at the time, and they, I stayed with them one of the weekends I was there, and the wife said to me, I want you to know, I hope it's okay. I'm not comfortable calling you Rabbi Sue, only because you're the same age as, or you're younger than my children, and it's hard for me. I'm used to having a rabbi who's older, and I'm just not there right now. And over the 2 years that I was with that congregation, at some point in that second year, perhaps it was even the end of the first year, she made a point of coming to me and saying, "You're my rabbi, and I want you to know that I feel completely comfortable calling you Rabbi Sue." And just it was affirming to hear that, and know that that was because of who I had been in this role and what I had done, and the relationships that I had tended to over that time. And I think that uh, I, I've found that in a lot of the things that I've been involved in throughout my life, that I've had these opportunities to be lifted up. And I've worked for those moments, but just by being, engaged in partnership with others, I think that that's part of how we do it. Um, but the challenge is that I think we often feel like we have to fight for it, and we often feel, as women, we often feel like we have to fight for it even after we've earned it. And I think that that's a challenge, is to make sure that as women, that we are that we're giving that opportunity to everyone who's earned it, and making sure that others' voices are lifted up, so that the next ones who come along, that their voices will be lifted up. They won't have to fight as hard for it. And I feel very fortunate that there were a number of female rabbis who really paved that path for me and for others of my colleagues, and who had a much harder road, a much more challenging, to that type of acceptance. And I also feel fortunate that I happen to be in a community, in a congregation in which I've had those opportunities. As I said earlier, the allyship and the support that I've had from the senior rabbi I work with, Bruce Lustig, and from other colleagues that I've had, where there is that sense of respect for each other and for each other's abilities, and recognizing that there are times that one person is going to be the best person for a role or to do something, and also recognizing that it doesn't always have to be that same person, and being able to share that. I also feel incredibly supported in my life. My husband, who I met in rabbinical school, and has always helped me to lift my voice and helped me to think about how to continue to raise my voice. And certainly when I think back, I'll tell this story another time, but I definitely also look to my family, my parents and my grandfather, who was my rabbi growing up. And when I wanted to do something or be involved in something, no one ever said you can't do that because you're a girl or you're a woman. That I was always encouraged and supported to try. Even if I didn't succeed, it was the trying, and I was never told you can't do that because you're a girl, you're a woman. But I do think it's challenging in different ways today for us, and thinking about how we continue to, again, support and lift up each other.
You know, what you said was so powerful, that we have to fight, right, even after we've earned our place. And that is just, I think, kind of sums up everything we've been talking about, at least in this part of our conversation, in terms of women just given that space. But then when you've earned it and you're in that position, and you've made you've given your dues to even be in that position, that you still have to fight for it, because there are people who are going to knock you down, and there are people who are not going to see the benefit that you bring into the table, and they nitpick on things that really are mindless, like the whole conversation about your outfit. Right? Like when you said that, it just reminded me of an experience I had in October. I was invited to speak at the Washington National Cathedral as the only Muslim speaker on that panel. And it was—
I think I was there for that one.
Oh, okay, cool. Like, it was fun, right? The conversation was really fun. And then afterwards, I had a male person from Adams, you know, who comes to Adams. They're like, "Oh, I watched." He didn't even say I watched. I saw your picture of you at the Washington, you know, Cathedral. He's like, you know, maybe women shouldn't sit with their legs crossed. And he's like, you know, I don't think it's appropriate. And I was like, excuse me? And I was like, where did this conversation even start for it to end on this? And so then I put him on the spot. I was like, did you watch the whole thing? He's like, no. I said, did you watch any of it? He said, no. I said, well, why don't you go watch the whole thing first, and then come and tell me and talk to me about my legs being crossed and me wearing high heels. Like, that's none of your business. What I wear and don't wear, that's between me and my God. But the fact that you can come and attack women on their clothes because you feel it's not appropriate, yet you didn't even listen to a word I said, right? You didn't even hear any of the jokes I made because they were funny, right, Susan? You know, and you're coming and talking to me about how I should be dressed and how I'm supposed to be representing. And when people give women, you know, spaces to speak in faith spaces, you knock them down because you don't look for the good things, because you don't even listen to the video. You don't listen to the words that were being said, but you're going to look at the image that's being portrayed. Right. And again, it's this fighting, right? Fighting when you've already earned it. And I'm sorry, Susan, that you had to go through that in rabbinical school and had to, you know, even going through that, you persevered and you did something that I can say very few women in the Jewish tradition have done, right? To be, I don't even know how many female rabbis there are in the United States, but I'm sure you're not a lot. And you know, you're one of them. That's a lot. That's like big deal.
Right. I think that point that you made about fighting is so important. I'll share this piece of advice because I'm a strong believer in therapy. So I do go to therapy. But my therapist said to me the other day, because I was sharing a similar experience about, you know, being dismissed or feeling invisible. And she told me, she said, going forward, I want you to walk into a room like Michelle Obama. She said, meaning, she said, when Michelle Obama is asked a question, you don't see her get defensive about it. She was like, what she does is she knows what she knows. She responds to it. And then she also says sometimes, if I need your help, she said, I imagine her saying, if I need your help, then I will certainly reach out to you and ask. Because a lot of times we are dismissed, although we might have the credentials, although we might have what it takes to get the job done. But I think if we take on this attitude sometimes that, you know, I know what I know, I can do what I can do, and I'm gonna do it and do it well, which is why I appreciate the times in which I've had, and I say this because I've had a lot of brothers. Someone raised the question about how do you find an ally when you're a minority in a space, is that, I've had brothers to support me in my work. And one of the people that I celebrate is Charles Watson Jr., who's been working alongside me in the religious freedom world. But at the same time, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, I remember when I started managing the African Americans and Religious Freedom Project, and a scholar was needed to take the lead on the project. And Corey said on that call, he was just like, Sabrina's right there. She has a doctorate. She could do the work. And so I appreciate that, he recognized that and continues to recognize that and continues to celebrate that in my work, as well as many other people that I can name, such as Melissa Rogers, who surprised me last year by inviting me to be on a panel when I didn't even imagine that, I would be that person, especially someone to her caliber. And I celebrate the work that she's done. So that point about fighting, and then also, knowing what we know and doing the work and having allies. And that's why it takes these conversations to happen.
And I agree. I think it's also about changing the assumptions that people have as well.
Absolutely.
People might not always be familiar with who can lead in different religious settings and different religions and faiths. And I just, this past weekend or a week ago, I did a wedding and long story, but they had to send someone to come greet me or meet me. And I was in one spot in my car, and there was a gentleman standing outside the door to my car. We're talking from socially distant, safely, with masks. And so somebody from the hotel came to meet me and comes over to that side of the car and starts talking to the man who was standing there as though he was the rabbi. And I was waiting and, hoping he's going to say something. And he did just as I did. And because I said, actually, I'm the rabbi. And he at the same time directed him and said, but it took a couple minutes that this gentleman from the hotel was talking to us and made the assumption that here's a woman, here's a man, the man's the rabbi. And I think that's just that takes time, and I think we're getting there. And certainly as we continue to create allies and think about how to be allies and support each other in all kinds of settings as men and women of faith, of and thinking about that in terms of race and gender and all kinds of different, we have to turn everything on its head a little bit more. To not make those assumptions and recognize that ours is not the only way of thinking or understanding the world. We have a way to go on that.
What happens when you don't unmute yourself? But so, taking that into consideration in terms of what we're talking about, allyship, and how do we, how do we get allies as minorities, as women? The struggles are real, even in our own workspace, in our faith space. So, when I was thinking about this constantly with the work I'm doing in my multi-faith work and working with people from different agencies and different faith groups, I noticed that I was getting more invitations and more acceptance from other faith groups and other organizations than I was from the Muslims, right? Because they only see the imam as someone who can speak on behalf of the American Muslim community, or the imam is going to, not everything is fiqh related or religious related, where you have to go over a certain topic, where the imam has to give an Islamic perspective on it, right? There's life, there's talk, there's just things that happen on a daily basis. And that's why I thought about this podcast. And that's why I wanted it to be diverse. I wanted it to be women, because, I'm an avid believer, and I've said this so many times before, that if people don't give you space, you have to make space yourself. And that's what drove me to make this podcast, because I was not being given that space as a Muslim woman working in the faith space, right? I had to constantly have to deal with men who weren't able to convey a certain message, speak over me, or, pull the mic from my hand, sometimes. And so I'm not going to sit there and have a, battle about the mic with the guy. Like, okay, well, if you don't want to give me that space, I'm going to make it myself. And, you have to believe in yourself. You have to look at the talents that you have and work with that, right? You have so many things resources, not everything is about, competing with someone else, because that's not our objective here. Our objective is tell our stories, right? And just in this one conversation over this one topic, we've said so much, and still there's a whole life that each one of us have lived that we haven't talked about, which what this podcast is all about, is talking about our lived experience through faith and connecting this back to faith, right? And what I went through growing up with my mother not being in my life. What also gives me solace and tranquility is, as Muslims, we believe that we're going to be reunited with our loved ones in paradise, right? So, I'm trying to be as good of a Muslim as I can be, so that I can be reunited with my mother and that I can experience her with me forever, right? And for us, this world that we're living with right now is a test about where we're going to be. Right? Everything, if I lived only about for this world, I would be literally really sad that this is all I have, because this world has so much destruction, so much sadness, and so much evil, that if it was just this for me personally, I would be really, really sad. So, again, connecting it to our faith, what does Judaism say about, having that faith in God, and Christianity and spirituality? All of our faiths teach this, to always rely on God and the being that is there, and then connecting it to our daily life. And that is something, as people of different faith traditions and spiritualities, we can all say we have. Right. So if you guys have any last words you want to say before we sign off, please.
I'm glad that you created this space to have a platform for women and our voices, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. And I hope that we continue to build upon the allyship that we have started, in the sisterhood that we're starting right now.
Absolutely.
And I celebrate also I celebrate the good that's still happening on the earth, because there is still a lot of goodness that I celebrate, and I live in the moment, and I live for good moments that happen, and I learn from the challenges. So
absolutely. And look at the impact we're going to have for future females who would hopefully listen to this in maybe 10 years, 15 years, and say, oh, look, there are 3 women from completely different backgrounds, from completely different walks of life, but there's so much commonality in their stories, and they can be friends, and they can be co-hosts, and they can support one another.
Yes.
I'm feeling incredible gratitude for both of you. And also, I feel like there are so many possible topics for future conversations that have been tossed out or shared, that we're going to have a lot. We know a lot to talk about. And just based on what you just said, Hernessa, one of my daughters texted me at one point while we were talking, and reminded me of something, and just knowing that she's listening, which I didn't know that she was listening, and I love that. And for all those young women out there and young men, to be able to be part of that conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a lot more work to do, but I'm so glad that I have you two to do this work with. I wouldn't trade either one of you for anybody else. You're with me whether you like it or not. We're in this together.
Yes, we are.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, ladies, it was so nice talking to you today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks everyone for listening for another episode of the Sister Act podcast. We will be back next week. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.